Hello there, my name's Card. I work as a social sciences researcher, although in my spare time, for quite a while now, I've very proudly been something of a progressive community activist and organiser. Today, I'd like to address something I feel is well worth pointing out, and just so happens to overlap somewhat with both of those areas I'm involved in. That is, that leftists, on the whole, need to be able to identify reactionary dog whistles and in-jokes in order to be able to call them out more effectively. At the moment, I'm sure most of my fellow progressives would agree with that sentiment, but I see very few people around, offline or online, seemingly who can in practice. I want to make this video a sort of very short PSA touching on this and how you can get better at recognizing covert fascistic slogans, tropes, and imagery. Just in case you did somehow make it to listening to this video of mine without knowing what I'm talking about here, the briefest possible explanation is essentially that a dog whistle, in the sense we'll be using that word today, is something like a word or a phrase or a picture that looks and sounds completely innocent and innocuous, but actually communicates a second, much more sinister meaning to a small in-group of people you can't otherwise address openly. It's a message that only a select group can understand the real meaning behind. The term itself comes from how, if you blow a literal, actual dog whistle, obviously dogs can hear the high-pitched tone, but people can't. And anyone who takes leftism seriously as a cause really ought to be doing more to not let people on the far right get away with being able to use these. What spurred me into wanting to make this video is that I was at a left-wing counter-protest of some assorted reactionaries not too long ago, and alongside plenty of people I've done a lot of other community defense type stuff with before. And on this occasion, in between the usual slogan-bearing placards and signs being carried by the right-wingers there, I noticed quite a few that were outright invoking a lot of coded racial slurs and neo-Nazi in-jokes. I pointed these out to the people I was with at the time, and I was very surprised to learn how few of the people I was there with could recognize this stuff, even though I was there with some otherwise very knowledgeable and grounded lefties. But it really left me with the impression that this broad progressive left community might not be able to spot this sort of thing as well as I had assumed based off how well I could. And perhaps that's just a consequence of the fact I'm not averse to lurking some of the more reprobate websites around just to see what the reactionaries are up to. But I'm going to take the position that us on the left could all benefit from that level of familiarity with the right's tropes. After all, knowing is half the battle. Now, when I bring up this sort of thing in conversation face to face with other progressives and explain the concept, even if they haven't heard of it expressly before, they tend to be able to recognize this sort of behavior in at least some of the more prominent examples right away. Something like when a conservative commentator like Tucker Carlson says heritage Americans are under attack when he's really just trying to whip up anxious anger among his base, because heritage Americans just means white people. He's all but just doing a neo-Nazi talking point, except when he throws just the slightest veneer over the top of it, it becomes significantly harder to point this out to a third party. Or you might hear someone denounce the elites for trying to undermine polite society for their own ends. There, they're just doing general anti-Semitic tropes without ever coming right out with it and saying it's the Jews. Traditional values or family values or hilariously Judeo-Christian values, for example, is almost always just a stand-in for something homophobic or transphobic. And there's countless others floating around out there among even mainstream conservative media. Welfare queen, states' rights, that sort of thing. Political science students will be all too familiar with the oft-cited quote by American GOP consultant Lee Atwater regarding the so-called Southern strategy, and how by the 1960s you couldn't win public support by just openly screaming racial epithets any longer. But I think that if you assume that dog whistles and coded messaging is something that's only being perpetuated by professional politicians and media figures, you've vastly missed the mark here. Doing a little preliminary research before I got around to making this video, I was able to find just a handful of other people on YouTube and the like that have gone slightly further and correctly pointed out that a lot of online reactionaries have made a career for themselves doing the exact same thing, just on new media platforms. People like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, and Paul Joseph Watson all now have, or have had, substantially large followings picked up by just spewing all the same barely disguised right-wing talking points that conservative old media does, just now in a new, slick online format instead. And they're correct to point out these sorts of people and to denounce their actions. But what I couldn't find, despite looking fairly hard, was anyone that addressed specifically what I want to focus on calling out here. Because pointing out that the right has a bunch of simple coded phrases is just scratching the surface. The sort of dog whistling being done by no-name reactionary individuals, people with no public presence of any kind, but who hold super exceedingly far-right views and who attempt to covertly signal their fascist sympathies to the other anonymous reactionaries. What this looks like in practice is a long list of esoteric symbols, memes, abbreviations, and in-jokes that might outwardly appear nonsensical or even completely random, that are getting surreptitiously spread around anonymously by the lone reactionary cretins looking for others of their own kind. If you look closely, you might just see them being commented all over the internet, and even all over regular mainstream sites like YouTube and Facebook, and even offline where they're being made into stickers and being done as graffiti tags and put up where you even might least expect it in public spaces. In recent years, the iconography used by these people to communicate has looked like oblique references to everything from clowns to milk to frogs to the OK hand sign, and dozens of practically arbitrary emojis. It's all been built up over years and years into this multi-layered pseudo-law where just about anything can become a signifier of the far right. The ones I just mentioned are some of the more widely known nowadays, but definitionally these things start out only known to insiders. It wouldn't surprise me if just about any and every individual closed reactionary community or cell of wannabe fascists has its own unique language of words and symbols that we're only likely to find out about years down the line, if ever at all. The main reason I wanted to write this video was to really articulate the fact that really the worst of this stuff is being spread by completely low-profile people, and you need to be on the lookout for it and preemptively call it out and combat it whenever and wherever you see it. I hadn't realized that many of my fellow lefties just fundamentally don't know what they're supposed to be on the lookout for. And I don't know exactly where you'd even begin if you wanted to teach someone all this stuff who hasn't had the organic experience of learning it over years and years of lurking image boards. Not to mention, those types of people are much more likely to themselves be fascists rather than progressives. Say, for example, you're just some normal lefty type. I can sit you down for a lesson on why online right-wingers appropriated a cartoon frog, and after a few hours, sure, you might get it. But do I expect anyone to be able to follow along as I then begin to elaborate on what the difference between a Pepe, an Apu, a Grouper, and a Honkler are without them thinking I'm completely insane? No, I don't. Half the right's own strategy is to make these memes of theirs so bizarre that anyone who calls them out looks ridiculous. And since it would be so hard for a regular person to connect all the dots here on their own, reactionaries have a lot of plausible deniability when they inevitably say that, oh, actually, the loony left is just calling everything racist again. With all this said, the best piece of advice I can offer people listening to this is simply to remain vigilant. Keep your wits about you and always be persistent in denouncing reactionary dog whistles when you do see them. By their very nature, no one can comprehensively tell you what they all are. I wish I could, but it'd be impossible. The very second you compile that list, it would be out of date. The whole online culture moves so fast you can never pin it down, and the very nature of these things makes them ever-changing and also near impossible to predict. But if you do want to start recognizing these sorts of things so that you can appropriately deal with them, the best advice I have would simply be that you need to stick your heads into the sorts of places online where these people congregate. Brace yourselves for most likely seeing some pretty unpleasant things, but do take a look at all the comments on right-wing Facebook and Twitter pages and start looking for things like frequently repeating words or emojis. If you really want, try this. Just invisibly hang around somewhere like 4chan's infamous poll board for 15 minutes until you see a word you don't know. Google it, and the first result will probably be to a resource like the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Anti-Defamation League, explaining that it too is, of course, a dog whistle. There, you just learnt another one to be on the lookout for. That's all I wanted to say for now. Just keep your eyes open. Once again, my name's Card. This has been Card Posting. Bye for now. Until next time, take care and have a lovely day.